Hi, welcome to Casa Stanacar. We are in our first edition of some sort of digital distance learning attempt. So, as you can see on the screen, our first topic is going to be some Fourth Amendment issues. Now, a lot of these things are things that you guys might have read about if you did the reading assignment that I gave, although I feel like I probably need to explain a couple ideas. So let's get going here. The Fourth Amendment is your privacy rights, as you can see. Although, if you take a look at the Fourth Amendment, it doesn't actually say privacy anywhere in it. What it does say is that you have the right to be secure in your person, houses, papers, and effects, basically in your body, your home, your legal life, like, your transcripts or your financial papers, and your effects, which basically is like your stuff. You have the right to feel secure in those things. And if you take those things together and bundle them up, then this is your privacy rights. This is what the Supreme Court defines as privacy, is the right to be secure in those areas. It begs the question then, though, secure against what? Well, it's right here. You are to feel secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. So, essentially, like we talked about with the First Amendment, where there's all these limitations on your First Amendment religion and speech rights based on other people's rights. Well, the Fourth Amendment actually has a limitation built into the wording of the Fourth Amendment, which is that you have the right to feel secure in those areas against unreasonable searches and seizures. But what that means is that you will have to deal with what are going to be labeled reasonable searches and seizures, and those will not be seen as a violation. And we're going to get into what is a reasonable search according to the Supreme Court here very shortly. The second thing the Fourth Amendment talks about is your warrant rights. And basically what your warrant rights mean is it's a second limitation on your privacy. Basically, we can violate your privacy as long as we have a warrant. We need certain things to get warrants. We need probable cause, which is based on evidence. And we also need some sort of particulars that we're looking for, where and who and when and that kind of stuff. But basically, a warrant is a second form of restriction to your privacy. The first being the reasonable searches and seizures. The second being we can violate those if we have a warrant. In other words, it becomes reasonable to violate your privacy if we've gone through the warrant process. Now, the privacy is a different kind of right. So if you think about it, if you are having your First Amendment religion rights being taken from you, then it's easy to fix, because as soon as it's determined that you indeed were being oppressed in this way, we can give you back your right to worship, in the way you want, and off you go. If you have your speech rights taken from you, then we give you the right to speak again. But once you had your privacy violated, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's hard for me to unlearn something that you wanted me to not know. So it's the Fourth Amendment is very difficult for a lot of legal reasons that hinge on the idea that once you know something, you can't unknow it. And so the best we have is this exclusionary rule, which basically means that if there's any evidence that has been gained in a way that violates the Fourth Amendment, then we're not going to let that be used in court. Jury's going to be told, you can't remember this, you can't talk about this. Well, that's going to be tough, because of course human beings remember, and human beings will, can't intentionally forget something. And so it's going to be problematic, but that's the best we got. Now, a lot of police officers will talk about the fruit of the poison tree. And what they mean by that is that any evidence that is deemed to be taken from some bad moment where the Fourth Amendment was violated, or something that came later because of that bad moment, any of that, all that stuff is going to have to be ignored during court. So if I find evidence A and that led me to think about evidence B and that led me to think about evidence C, but A was found to be bad, well then A, B, and C are all going to be considered fruit from that one poisoned tree, and therefore none of that's going to be allowed. Now, this does not mean that if this happens that the prosecutors or police are going to make have to give up. It just means that they're going to have to create a case without that evidence. Now, just like all the other rights, the Fourth Amendment is a personal right, which basically means that you are in charge of it. You can choose to give it up if you want. In the case of speaking, you choose not to speak. In the case of privacy, you give consent to the police to search or the government to search. So you're in charge of this. But that also means you have to know about it in order to claim it. So when somebody says, can I do this? You have to know enough to say no. Now, the second part about being a personal right is that your privacy cannot protect somebody else. So my home and my Fourth Amendment privacy rights to be secure in my home can protect me, but I can't claim privacy to protect my friend who came over. Just me. So that's the basics. Basically, privacy means security of person, place, or security of person, home, effects, and papers. And you have two restrictions. One's going to be reasonable searches, which we're going to talk about, and the other one is warrant. Warrant makes everything reasonable. So the rest of this video is going to be talking about the exceptions to the reasonable, unreasonable search. In order to talk about those things first, we have to talk about like a baseline. And the baseline is that any time the government or the police wish to search or seize, you must have a warrant. They must have a warrant. This is warrant. And this guy right here, everybody thought was really hot in high school, and I just don't see it. But back to this. So you have any search or seizure requires a warrant. So let's talk about how one might look. So many have heard this phrase here, reasonable suspicion. And what that means is essentially that the police have reason to suspect that something might be going wrong. This doesn't have to be it's not a very high threshold. It's just, hey, I've been a police officer for a long time and that looked wrong. So I'm going to look into it. If a police officer can show that they had reasonable suspicion, then that gives them the right to investigate, ask questions. And what they're doing is they're trying to go from something reasonable suspicion to something more, which is probable cause. So let's consider a situation. So you are pulled over for drunk driving because you raised some reasonable suspicions. You were weaving in your lane, your blinker was on, you couldn't maintain a proper speed, and so the police officer behind you had reason to suspect that you were doing something that might have been illegal. So at that point, the police officer has the right to investigate further. So what does he do? He turns on the lights because he can't ask you questions while you're driving, pulls you over, and then he starts asking you questions, asks about your driver's license. And what he's doing is he's not only trying to get the answer to some of these questions, but he's also trying to figure out, okay, do you smell like alcohol? Are you fumbling with your license because you're impaired? And if the answer to those questions makes him, worry that, yes, you are impaired, then he's just gone from reasonable suspicion, which is just simply I have some reason to suspect, to probable cause, which basically means I now have reason to believe that there is probably a crime about ready to happen. I have cause to believe there is probably a crime happening. At that point, he has the right to get, or the ability to get, a warrant. I mean, he's getting ready to violate your privacy, and therefore he needs to get the proper warrant to do so. But we know that that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is he's just going to give you the breathalyzer test, or at least the option to do that. And why is that? Well, it's because it's reasonable. If you think about it, what's going to happen is if he goes and has to leave you to get a warrant, you're going to do a couple things. You're either going to drive off, in which case he's going to, you're going to harm, somebody, or you're going to cause a danger, and you're going to get away. Or two, but while he's sitting there waiting for somebody to deliver the warrant, or comes back to you're sitting there with the, ready for the warrant, you're going to metabolize that alcohol, and the evidence is going to disappear. So it seems reasonable that rather than waiting for him to go get a warrant, that we give the police officer the ability to just simply give you the breathalyzer test, violate the Fourth Amendment, and invade your body. It seems reasonable. Reasonable, in other words, meaning that I'm not going to let the evidence disappear, and I'm not going to let this person drive off because they might harm somebody. So there's your unreasonable, you're only protected against unreasonable searches, but this seems to be reasonable to let the police officer do that. And so we have our first example of an exception. So then let's talk about a couple other exceptions. So, what if the police officer is in a dangerous situation? There's multiple people. It's late, he's all by himself. There's concern that there's a weapon involved in some sort of conversation that he's having with several suspects. So it seems reasonable at this point to allow what's known as a stop and frisk. And a stop and frisk is mostly designed to make sure that the police officer is not in a dangerous situation. The police officer can do it to make sure that they're safe. Now, it's not going to be considered a search, or rather it's going to be a reasonable exception to the search idea, because they're not going to be like looking in things. They're going to be patting you down from the outside. No one's putting their hand in a pocket or anything like that. So it seems reasonable for the sake of officer safety that we let this happen. Now we're going to skip a couple other things that you just might have seen, and we're going to talk about a second idea that was in the packet, which is the idea of a hot pursuit. So essentially, keeping our same idea that all these things are reasonable exceptions, well, it seems reasonable that if a police officer is chasing somebody and that person runs into someone else's house, that the officer doesn't need to stop and say, "Can I come in?" or go get a warrant to race through the backyard of somebody's house. In this case, it is reasonable to allow the police officer to continue the chase, and we're going to call that hot pursuit. It's like a condition. We are in hot pursuit. Obviously, it's going to be reasonable if you say it's okay. It's a personal right, and if you decide that we are going to let the police officer, the government, look at something, well, that's you giving up your personal right. That's your choice. It is, in fact, your personal right. So if you give it up, you give it up. You can't even complain. And finally, for this video, future videos we'll talk about more exceptions, but for this video, it seems reasonable that when conditions and circumstances are exigent, meaning they are urgent, like there's a school shooter or there's a murder happening, that the police don't need a warrant to come in. They can act in order to stop a dangerous situation, and that would be reasonable to allow the police to do that without warrant, even though it might technically be entering somebody's home or a building, a business's place, private place, without warrant. So we call those exigent circumstances. Now we're going to stop there because the free version of this screencaster only gives me a 15-minute time limit, and we will pick up at this point with future video. So, hope this helps.